Welcome to all of you. It's great that so many of you have chosen to join us for today's briefing. It's great to have you with us. As Catherine said, today's briefing is on our annual report of the results of our probation inspections, which was published this morning, and you can see a copy of it on our website. And it follows a similar report which we published last week on the results of our youth offending inspections. I'm going to speak for about half an hour, and then there will be another half an hour or so for questions. So do save up your questions for then. For the question and answer session, I'll be joined by a couple of my colleagues, Simi Badecha and Helen Rinaldi, who are the two heads of our probation inspection teams, and they will be on hand to answer questions with me as well. I think just to start off with, to acknowledge what a challenging year it has been for the probation service, and I'll say a bit more about those challenges as we go on, but I know myself and our inspection teams have been hugely impressed with the resilience and the professionalism that everyone working in probation has shown over the past year, and I pay tribute to the service for how they've dealt with those challenges. It's been quite a challenging year for the inspectorate ourselves as well. We had to stop all of our on-site face-to-face inspection activity at the end of March, and since then I've had to switch entirely into doing inspections remotely over software like this, MS Teams, or through Zoom or Skype. We also had to stop doing our local probation inspections, and we won't be restarting those until February of next year. And instead, we've been focusing on big national thematic inspections, particularly looking at the impact of COVID and how the service is recovering from COVID as we move into that recovery stage. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. In today's presentation, I want to do two things looking back over the past year. I want to summarize a bit about what we found about those impacts of COVID, particularly during the first lockdown period from March until June. And then I want to give you a summary of the results of the inspections, the 11 inspections, which we were able to conduct before the end of March, and some of the key themes that have come out of that. So to start off with, the impact of COVID on the probation service. In June, we were able to conduct an inspection across 6 different areas in England and Wales, involving both CRC and MPS local areas. We looked at 60 cases, half of which had started before the pandemic, half of which afterwards. We were able to interview 85 staff, and importantly, we were also able to talk to 33 service users, and we used a consultancy called Epic to help us with that, and they use people with lived experience to interview service users on our behalf. As you'd expect, the impact of COVID was very profound on probation and indeed on the whole criminal justice system. Many courts stopped at the front end of the process. Many courts stopped sitting altogether or sat with very reduced hours. There was a reduction of about 3/4 in the volume of new community orders and suspended sentence orders that were being given out, and an equivalent reduction in the number of court reports that the probation service was having to produce. Prison population is down by about 4,500 compared to last year, so a big reduction in the numbers going through the system, particularly in that lockdown period up until June. And the probation service had to completely change its operating model almost overnight, from an assumption that people will be met face to face to a reliance on probation staff working from home and contacting people on their caseloads by phone. And 80 to 90% of contacts with people on caseloads were by phone, with face-to-face appointments in those first 3 months of lockdown well under 10% of appointments, and very much focused on the very high risk, the highest risk offenders, tact offenders. And where people didn't have. Hello.
Hello, Justin. It's Catherine here. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hello there. I think we just interrupted a little bit of a disruption then, so perhaps take it just from the last point that you were making. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I was talking about face-to-face contact, and very small numbers of that was possible during that first lockdown period. For homeless service users who didn't have access to a phone, great efforts were made to try and provide them with that access. And I know some mobile phones were given out, but in the main, people were contacted by phone. Home visits obviously had to stop as well. And for higher risk offenders, there were some doorstep checks carried out where probation officers would basically drive up in front of someone's home address and ring them on their mobile to check that they were at the address that they were supposed to be at. In terms of the impact on the types of work that the service was doing, pretty much all unpaid work, community payback, was suspended. Some accredited programs were continued where people had already started those, but there were very few new accredited program started. Approved premises did carry on operating, but with a reduced capacity. Overall, the probation caseload came down by about 12% over this period, so caseloads perhaps became a bit more manageable. But on the other hand, 2,000 staff were self-isolating during the early weeks of lockdown, either because they had symptoms themselves, because they were in a vulnerable group, although about 1,100 of those were able to do some work from home. Our inspection of local probation areas and their response to COVID. Just trying to get the next slide up. Catherine, are you able to get the next slide up?
I'm sorry, I'm not. I don't have.
That's okay, Justin. I think I can. 1 second.
I will keep talking while we do this. But just to say, in terms of the results of our inspection of the work that was undertaken in this, thank you very much. The work that was undertaken in the 6 areas we looked at, there was much to praise. As I said, we felt that the service responded very well and to the situation they were facing. There was an understandable risk, I think, on risk and also the well-being and welfare of people on caseloads. For service users who are in a reasonably stable home position, actually remote supervision over the phone could work quite well. Service users told us they quite like being able to speak on the phone with their probation officers, and it saved people having to sort out childcare or sort out public transport. We found evidence of innovation, for example, imaginative ways of trying to keep in contact with domestic abuse victims with some tech schemes set up to do that. A lot of work went into homelessness prevention, with homelessness prevention teams being set up in every probation areas, additional money made available, and close working with local authorities to find accommodation and keep people off the streets for this first 2 months after people were released from prison. And the great majority of the staff that we spoke to said that they'd had very good support from their line managers, and many of them welcomed being able to work flexibly from home. So I think lots of positives about the way the service responded, and we reflected that in the report that we have published on the impacts of COVID. But next slide, please. But clearly some big challenges as well. I think although there was a big focus on risk, and that was important during those early months of lockdown, there is a need now to get back into doing the intervention activity, the reducing reoffending activity, and the volumes of delivery of that have slipped. There's probably only about half of accredited program, the normal levels of accredited program activity happening at the moment. And although there was an understandable focus on the highest risk people on caseloads in those early months, people with other vulnerabilities, I think, do need more support. And certainly service users told us that they did welcome face-to-face contact when they were feeling isolated or vulnerable. And probation officers told us that during those first 3 months of lockdown, it could be quite difficult to refer people to help from mental health or substance abuse services. It's been good to see the work and the investment that's been made in short-term accommodation for those first 2 months. But again, staff are telling us they were worried about longer-term accommodation, follow-on accommodation for people who've been in temporary B&B provision, and that really has to be a priority going forward. And obviously, with the reduced capacity of the service to deliver unpaid work or accredited programs or RAR interventions, quite a significant backlog of cases has built up and will need to be dealt with over the coming months, and that will be a big challenge. We have been looking at the progress that the service has been making in recovering from that first lockdown, and have just completed the field work on that in 12 different services, looking at a big sample of 240 cases. We will report in the new year. Next slide, please. The impacts of COVID and the challenges of COVID obviously came on top of what had been a pretty challenging scenario anyway in terms of resources over the past 10 or 15 years. There's been a 40% decline, a real terms decline in the amount of funding per case under supervision up until March of 29. And that decline in funding has probably been even more for the CRC low and medium risk cases. Next slide, please. And a big reason for the reduction in funding and the real funding problems that the private sector CRC companies have been facing over recent years has been some pretty fundamental flaws in the way that the TR contracts were set up and the contract mechanism behind them. In particular, the reliance on payment by results funding and issues around particularly prolific reoffending rates, which have meant that CRCs have ended up with significantly less income than they were expecting. And the Lord Chancellor told the Select Committee last year that the total underspend was about £700 million over the 7-year lifetimes of the contract. So that's 700 million less going into CRCs than was originally forecast when these contracts were first let. And the inevitable result of that, we were finding in our first cycle of inspections over 28 and 2019, was that probation officers had come down, caseloads were getting very big, and there were some real issues around risk management. So in our first cycle of inspections, we ended up rating 20 out of 21 CRCs as requiring some improvement. And people will know that one of the providers, Working Links, covering the Southwest and Wales, went into administration at the beginning of last year, and its services were taken over by CTEC. So that was the picture at the beginning of our second year of inspections, which started in the summer of last year. And what did we find from those? Next slide. Well, we looked at 10 different services before lockdown at the end of March, 10 different CRCs, and also one national probation service, which was the Northwest MPS. Next slide. And in terms of our overall ratings, I think we basically, although it was a limited sample, it was only 11 out of 28 services that we were able to inspect by the end of March. I think there were some signs of improvement. So 4 of the 10 services we were able to give an overall rating, and we weren't able to do that for Hampshire and Isle of Wight because that inspection was disrupted by COVID. But for the 10 services that we were able to give one of our overall ratings, we rated 4 as good, and that included 3 CRCs which we previously rated as requires improvement, and those were Durham and Tees Valley, which is operated by ARC, South Yorkshire, which is a Sodexo service, and Thames Valley, which is operated by MTC. Next slide. Those overall ratings reflect the aggregated scores from 10 different standards, which we inspect against in every service that we look at. And this chart along the bottom shows what each of those 10 standards are. And along the left-hand vertical axis, you can see the average score that each of the 11 schemes we inspected achieved. The first 4 standards, that's 1.1 through to 1.4, look at the overall health or organisational corporate health and organisational delivery and management of the service. And we arrive at those judgments through a whole series of focus groups and interviews with staff at every level of the organisation, and through a look at management information. And you'll see from this graph that in general, CRCs quite often perform reasonably well on some of those standards. In particular, I'd flag the information facility standard, where we're finding CRCs operating out of quite good office accommodation, often quite better accommodation than the MPS are able to provide their staff. And we're finding many CRCs with quite an extensive menu of services that they are able to offer. The second six set of standards, 2.1 through to 4.2, we reach our judgments on by looking at samples of individual cases. And over the last year, we've been able to look at 2,000 individual cases. We look at the quality of routine day-to-day offender management. We look at the quality of assessment of cases, of planning, of implementation and reviewing. And we also look at those two particular functions of CRCs, their supervision of unpaid work and the quality of through the gates. You'll see that for the quality of offender management services by responsible officers, we continue to have concerns about that and find much of that still requires improvement. But we have found reasonably good performance actually in relation to unpaid work and quite a significant improvement in the quality of through the gate services that we've seen over the past year. And that's been really encouraging. 8 out of the 10 CRC services that we inspect, we've actually rated them outstanding on through the gate. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that the extent to which those key questions we are asking around through the gate, how much they have improved. So this is the proportion of the through the gate cases we look at where we think they're satisfactory against each of these three key questions about the quality of resettlement work. So over 85% of through the gate cases we looked at, we felt were satisfactory. And I think that's a direct result really of the additional £22 million a year that's been going into enhanced through the gate since April 2019. Our inspectors have been told that's made a real difference. Prison governors are seeing the difference. We're finding many more through the gate staff now in prison, and some imaginative contracting and commissioning with voluntary sector organisations to provide support with mentoring and accommodation as well. And we think that's been paying off over the last year. Next. We've also found other areas, I think, of improvement and areas of positive progress and innovation in the CRCs that we've looked at. I mentioned unpaid work. 8 out of 10 services we rated good on their unpaid work supervision. And over the course of the last few years, there's been some really interesting experimentation by CRCs in terms of where lower risk offenders are met, use of community centres and church halls, for example, in the Durham Tees Valley and other areas to try and meet service users closer to where they live in a less stigmatising sort of environment. I've been really impressed by what some CRs have been doing to involve their service users as well. So RRP, for example, in the West and East Midlands, have, I think, offered employment opportunities to at least 50 ex-service users and closely involved service users in delivering induction courses and providing mentoring services as well. One of the hopes of TR was that it would lead to greater investment in IT. Sadly, that wasn't the case generally, but where companies were able to invest in new case management systems, and MTC with their Omnia system is the best example of that. That's gone down very well with staff, and they have welcomed that investment. Next slide. Having said all that, clearly there are some big challenges. And in effect, what we've seen is 2 tiers of CRC performance emerging over the last year. Some CRCs showing that they are now able to deliver good quality supervision, but other CRCs, and we rated 5 still as requiring improvement, still experiencing falls and cuts in their budgets as a result of ongoing issues with the contracts and having to therefore cut probation officer numbers. And we were concerned to see that they were often having to be replaced by more junior and more inexperienced probation service officers who were being asked sometimes to take on complex and medium risk cases, which we felt was beyond their capacity in some cases. Overall, the weakest area of performance remains the management of risk of harm. And over half of the cases that we looked at, we felt weren't satisfactory in terms of how risk of harm was being managed. Next slide. And just to illustrate this graphically and how much those scores varied, in general, actually, we find CRCs, when we look in detail at individual cases, are not doing a bad job at identifying the needs of people on their caseloads and identifying strengths as well in terms of sentence planning for desistance, and quite often are doing a good job of engaging service users in that assessment planning and delivery. But those scores for the management of risk of harm, and that's the darker blue bars on the right of each of these clumps, you can see that on 3 out of 4 of our key standards, less than half of those cases were satisfactory. Moving on. In terms of what's going wrong with risk of harm, we are still finding that the initial assessment of the level of risk can sometimes be wrong. So people being classified as low risk when they should have been medium, I think partly because of big caseloads, people are just focusing sometimes on the immediate index offence for which someone has been sentenced and are not spotting past behaviour or things that need to be taken account of. When reviewing ongoing risks of harm, people aren't picking up on sometimes quite significant changes of circumstances in terms of perhaps new partners or access to children or changes of address. And we're quite often finding that contingency planning is lacking. And a very specific and good example of where we're still seeing wide variation in risk management protocols is in the extent to which the police are being asked for domestic abuse intelligence on cases, which we expect to happen in every case. And in a third of cases, we're finding that those domestic abuse checks with the police are still not being met or made, and there are, as you can see from this graph, 4 CRCs where that was happening in less than half of the cases that we looked at. Next slide. It was, I think, reassuring and perhaps not unexpected to see that actually the quality of supervision of the highest risk cases was better than for some of the lower risk cases, and this chart shows the proportion of cases which we felt were satisfactory against each of those 4 key questions on the left relating to risk and safety. Obviously, the high risk cases will virtually always be managed by the MPS, whereas the CRC are focusing on the larger numbers of medium and lower risk cases. Particularly concerning to see some of those low scores around low risk cases, and only 12% of low risk cases we felt were being planned for sufficiently. The judgment about which risk category you go into has very important real world implications. If you're judged high risk, you're obviously more likely to get multi-agency MAPA supervision. You'll get a more experienced qualified probation officer supervising you. You'll be seen more frequently. You may have access to an approved premises if you come out of prison. None of those things would be available for lower risk cases, so that's why it's so important to get that risk rating right. And in our study of serious further offence reviews earlier in the year, we noted that 2/3 of the 120 or so homicides a year which are committed by people on probation are committed by people who had been rated medium or low risk, which brings home why it's so important to get those judgments and those plans and assessments right. Next slide. So that's risk and the management of risk and our ongoing concerns around that. But obviously, a second and really important function of probation is to try and change people and to turn people's lives around and to deal with the needs that people have that may be driving them towards offending behaviour, and build on the strengths that people have in their lives as well to promote desistance. As I said earlier, we feel that work's being done rather better, and it's important that it is done well because people on probation caseloads have a huge number of those needs. And this chart looks at the 8 key criminogenic factors that are captured on the OASIS system and how many of the people in the caseloads that we looked at had those factors. So almost 85% of the 4,500 cases we've looked at over the last 2 years have had issues around thinking and behaviour. About 50% of people have weak support from their families. 48% of people had a drug use problem. The percentages in blue shows the proportion of people who actually we felt had a service delivered to meet those needs which have been identified. And you can see here there's a pretty big gap. There's a lot of unmet need out there that's not being met through sentence plans or the range of services delivered. So, for example, of all of those people who had a drug misuse issue, which is over 2,000 in our sample, only 44% were getting help with that problem. We've had a particular focus on accommodation needs of people under probation supervision this year. We did an important thematic study of what those needs were. About 1 in 4 of the cases we look at do have an accommodation need. We know 11,000 people a year are being released from prison directly into homelessness, and our thematic found that issue being sorted out in terms of the attitude of landlords, issues with the benefit system, and a particular lack of supported accommodation and housing for people with complex needs, and in particular the lack of a cross-government strategy to deal with those needs of people coming out of prison and under probation supervision. I've seen some encouraging signs in recent months of that issue being tackled. I think a lot of work went into this issue during COVID, and it's promoted a lot of thinking around the way forward, and I really welcome that and hope that things will improve in the following years, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Next slide. Lying behind both the problem of dealing with people's needs and of managing risk adequately, we're continuing to find is the very high caseloads which some probation staff are managing. In our inspections last year, we found that although 95% of MPS responsible officers had less than 50 people on their caseloads, 2/3 of responsible officers in CRCs had over 50 cases on their caseloads, and 40% had over 60 on their caseloads. And in this year's inspections, we are still finding in some areas, not all areas, we're still finding in some areas, some PSOs in particular with over 70 cases, which can't be acceptable. And as this graph shows, over a half of probation officers and PSOs are still saying that they think their caseloads are unmanageable. There's some important new analysis in today's annual report, which looks at the impact of caseload on our judgments about supervision quality. And we clearly show that once caseloads go over 50, the judgments our inspectors make about the quality of work being done against 12 key standards significantly worsens, particularly around those risk of harm questions. This issue varies quite a bit over different areas. Next slide, please. So if we look at the proportion of people who said that their caseloads were not manageable across the different CRCs we've inspected this year, you can see quite a range. Only 1/3 of ROs we spoke to in South Yorkshire, which we rated good, said that that was an issue, but numbers were significantly higher in other areas. Next slide. And important to know, this isn't actually just an issue for CRCs, even though the caseloads may be lower in the National Probation Service. Probation officers in particular are still telling us in the MPS that they think their caseloads are not manageable. And you'll see 5 out of the 7 MPSs we inspected last year, that was the case, more than half of probation officers saying their caseloads were not manageable. Next slide. Just to flesh that out in a bit more detail, I think last year we were very concerned about staffing levels in quite a few MPS regions. All 7 MPS divisions we said required improvement on that issue. And in the summer of 2019, there were well over 600 MPS probation officer vacancies and some pretty high workloads for SPOs as well, often managing really big teams, bigger than would certainly be ideal. Next slide. I think it's fair to say, and it's good to see, there has been some improvement around staffing. The total PSP in post has increased by about 6% year on year up to June of this year. So that's about another 200 probation officers in post. The number of unfilled vacancies has come down, and it's been good to see that commitment to having 1,000 probation officers in training by the beginning of next year, and good to see the additional investment that's got into the probation service this year, 150 million more in the probation service this year And I understand that last week's spending review announcement means that investment will continue into next year, and I hope that continues to increase these number of staff and close those vacancies. Next slide, just a couple more slides before I open up for questions. Although I've focused today on the results of our local inspections, those 11 local inspections of probation, we have published some really important national thematic inspections over the course of this year. I've already talked about our inspection of COVID impacts and our inspection of accommodation for people under probation supervision. We also looked at integrated offender management, and it's been disappointing to see how much that's fallen away since our last inspection in 2015. I think everyone thinks IOM is a good idea, but it badly needs invigorating, and I think a review of that is going on at the moment. The Lord Chancellor asked us, people will know, to have a specific look at the case of Joseph McCann following the offences he committed at the beginning of 2019, and we took a very detailed look at his management and found some real concerns about how that case was managed, missed opportunities to revoke his IPP license, errors of judgment about his risk level, a lack of approved premises for him to stay in, all contributing to poor supervision, and that then added to by staffing and management issues in the Hertfordshire office that he was managed out of. We've done a second part of our review, which has looked more broadly at the way probation deal with recall and the culture and practice around that, and looked in particular at whether that's improved since the beginning of 2019, and we found that it had, and there is a much better balance now between a focus on public protection and the use of alternatives to recall. Serious further offences, we looked at a sample of 50 SFO reviews and the quality of those, and found some potential areas for improvement, in particular the need to learn more general lessons around policy and practice, and the need to learn the lessons for other agencies like the police as well as the probation service from those FSOs. And I was pleased that we've been asked by the Lord Chancellor to now inspect a sample of SFO reviews, independently inspect those every year, and we'll start to do that from next April, and we'll report on that on a regular basis. Next slide. So what about the future? That's the past. I think obviously the big event of next year will be the reunification of probation services from June the 26th. I've been very clear that structural change by itself isn't a magic bullet. It will need to be matched by extra resources if caseloads are to come down, and it's been good to see that hopefully those resources are coming through now. That transition period between now and the end of June will be very challenging. There's thousands of staff and cases to be transferred over. The IT needs to be got right. Buildings have to be transferred. And the new dynamic framework procurement has to be completed for some key services, and those services live by June. That's a big challenge. And obviously all of the things that we've been identifying in our inspections over the past 3 years have to be dealt with if the future is to be a brighter one for probation. And really important that the innovation and creativity that CRCs have been able to spark in some important areas are not lost to the service going forward. Final slide. In terms of our own work, we've got a busy year coming up ourselves as well. Really important thematic coming up jointly with all of the other criminal justice inspectorates on the quality of support for people with a mental health problem or an illness under probation supervision. We'll be kicking off a look at drug abuse services for people on probation in January, working jointly with the CQC, and we're doing a very important study at the moment of quality of provision for Black, Asian and minority ethnic service users as well. We'll be, obviously, as the service reforms from next year, we'll be reforming our own inspection methodology as well to focus in particular on more local delivery in the local probation LDUs, what will be called PDUs from next year. Final slide. Next slide. So that's it in terms of my presentation. Do go and have a look at our reports. These are the links to today's report, and you can also look at the detailed ratings that we've given each of the services that we've inspected, and there's a spreadsheet showing that on our on our website as well, and we'll make these slides available and a recording, I think, of this presentation too. I'm going to stop there now and invite questions. Catherine, shall I hand back to you?
Yes, Justin, that's fine. So that's great. Thanks very much for that presentation. So we've now got an opportunity now for any questions that anybody might have for the Chief Inspector. You can either ask those by pressing the raise hand button at the top of your screen, or by submitting your question on the chat. I haven't got any questions at the moment, so please feel free to come forward.
Can I also say, we also, as I said at the beginning, have Helen Rinaldi and Simi Badecha, our two heads of probation inspection, available to take questions and give insights from the inspections that they worked on. Helen, are you there?
I am, Justin.
Did you just want to offer any reflections on those CRCs, which we rated them as good? Does anything strike you about what they were doing right, or that would be worth commenting on?
I mean, that's a big question, Justin, in terms of what you could potentially cover. I think one of the things that was noticeable was that between our first year of CRC inspections and then the 10 that we managed to do up to the pandemic kicking in round 2, they had really taken seriously the recommendations that we had made, and the vast majority were considered to be either sufficient progress had been made, or at least some progress. A lot of the recommendations from year 1 focused on the deficits that we found in relation to the management of risk of harm, and I think those CRCs that fared better in round 2 had invested quite heavily in training to upskill staff on some of the basics. So they had gone back to basics and really focused on the risk of harm training. That was certainly the case in Durham Tees Valley, in the Sodexo CRCs, and in MTC. That's not to say other places hadn't also done training, but I think there were other things that had perhaps got in the way of that really landing. So those where there'd been higher turnovers, more new staff coming in, we're up against it. So I think where there was a more static workforce who'd kind of been retrained in some of the basics, that showed through in the cases, and that's what made the difference, I think.
Thanks, Helen. I think we're starting to get some questions in now. Did you want to read them out, Catherine, or shall I read them?
Yep, that's fine. We've got a question here from Ben Leapman, who's joining us from Inside Time. Hi there, Ben. There are 9,000 people in prison on recall, 1 in 8 of all prisoners. Your thematic report said the power is being used inconsistently. Is it being used too often? That's the first question.
I think having looked at a sample of recall cases, we felt that it was being used appropriately in general, but you're right that we did also find some variation between different areas. I think the CRC, from memory, the CRC with the highest recall rate was almost double the rate in the lowest CRC, so there was variation between them. There was slightly less variation, I think, between MPS areas. I think the overall rate was about 9 or 10% recall. We found differences in processes being followed in some areas. For example, the extent to which more senior managers were involved in those decisions. The other thing we looked at was what are called the sort of warnings, final warnings almost, that are given prior to potential recall, where we found a lot of variation in how those warnings were administered and used, and we recommend much more consistency in the way that they are delivered. Next question.
Yep, this is a question from Claire Wallace. I'm sorry, I don't know where she's from. I think potentially HMPPS. Would the use of homeless prevention influence would the use of homeless prevention influence how we work with service users at risk of being NFA in future? Do we know how effective the homelessness prevention team scheme has been to reduce reoffending?
In a formal evaluation of effectiveness, certainly anecdotally, probation officers we spoke to felt it was making a significant difference in the short term to the accommodation chances of people being released from prison. I think they'd previously been frustrated that they didn't have access to a budget to just sort someone's rent deposit out or pay for a B&B or hotel place in the short term. And they did have that through the HPT, and that was seen as a positive thing. But as I said, the key issue then becomes, what do you do longer term after that 56 nights worth of funding is used up? And that's the really big challenge that we identified in our accommodation thematic. It's good to hear that the HPT practical support is being extended into January, I think, of next year, but there's still a question mark about the longer term future of it, I think.
Right, thank you, Justin. The next question comes from Nicola Williams. Is there a plan regarding the inspection schedule immediately post-transition? Clearly, the transition and the changes will have an impact on staff and require a lot of work. I'd like to know whether there are plans to put inspections on hold for any time.
We're still planning our future inspection programme for the end of next year. We do recognise that services need time to make that transition, so we will be stopping our current cycle of inspections in April and allowing that space for people to transition to new structures before we go back in and inspect that. But we do recognise that people need that period to successfully make those changes and for people to get back into their new jobs. I mean, I think the fact that responsible officers are effectively lift and shifting their existing caseloads into the new structures will help in terms of the continuity of supervision and what we'll be able to look at. And my understanding is responsible officers will also take their existing line managers in as well. So that will hopefully, reduce risk, but also help with continuity.
Okay, thanks, Justin. The next question comes from Gayton, who's from the BBC. Court reports. Are there any plans to monitor their provision? And that's the question against the background of courts backlogs. And have you also seen any evidence that the MPS is gearing up for increased demand that should follow the police uplift?
On the court reports, yes, we do currently inspect the quality of court reports when we look at MPS services. We take quite large samples of them and make a judgment about how well they are assessed and the recommendations that are being made, and we will take that into our new methodology as well once the service has been unified. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
It was around have we seen any evidence that the MPS is gearing up for increased demand that should follow the police uplift?
Yeah, I mean certainly the MPS, I know in court reports in particular, the MPS have been working very hard to get more people into their court teams to deal with the backlog of court reports that will be needed, offering overtime and finding ways that people can be redeployed into those or brought back in to do that work. I haven't seen details of how the spending review resource will be allocated next year, but my understanding is it does include some recognition of the increased demands on the service next year, both from COVID actually and from police recruitment as well. I don't know if Simi is on the line. Simi, are you there? Could you, Simi Badecha?
Yes, hi Justin.
Do you want to say anything about court report inspections and how we do that?
Absolutely. So there's two ways that we currently inspect court reports, one being via the thematic inspection programme, but also we build in an assessment of the quality of court reports when we do our core inspection programme, looking at how well reports influence sentencing and assessments that are made in terms of the proposals. But also it's just worthwhile letting you know that this week we are on week 2 of our transitional inspection, where we are looking at the backlog of court hearings. And actually what we're hearing also and finding is the investment in digital hearings is helping them to address some of the backlog, particularly in the reduction of relistings for those that don't attend. So there are some efforts that are taking place to try and address that. But we will, as part of the ongoing transition inspection, look at and explore the impact of backlog for transition and the steps that are taken. So it's very much an area for us that we're starting to collect evidence on and around.
Thanks, Simi.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. Our next question is actually from Denise Butts. Denise, would you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question? Thank you.
Fine, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody from the inspection, everybody on the call. I just wanted to, I guess, a bit more of a general question in relation to the work of the inspectorate. Over the last couple of years, the inspectorate has been very, very supportive to CRCs, not just in the what of what they've done, but the how of it. So it's been a very, very supportive process, and certainly that's how we have experienced it. And I guess one of the things you said earlier in relation to structures can change, but actually it takes a lot of other components to ensure that the service delivery and the quality of what we deliver is going to change as well. And I guess one of the questions that I have got going around in my mind is around some of the differences in the culture that we have between the CRCs and the MPS. And I'm just wondering, from an inspectorate perspective, how the inspectorate is going to approach supporting the emergence of that new culture in terms of how it supports the new unified service going forward, because I think that's going to be quite a challenge.
I think you're right, Denise, to say it will be a challenge, and it's something we're looking very closely at in the transition inspection, which Simi just mentioned. It's coming up a lot in the focus groups and interviews that we are conducting with both CRC and MPS staff and managers. And I think there's a recognition on both sides that they have to get the culture piece right going forward, and it wasn't something that they got right during TR. Once we get back into, once we're through transition and then doing our new inspections, I think as part of what we call our domain 1 inspections, which is looking at the corporate organisation and delivery of each local service, we will certainly be looking at staff engagement and getting feedback from people on how it feels to be working in a new unified structure, and that will provide some really helpful intelligence, I think, on whether that culture change has been successfully embedded, or whether it still feels like two cultures going forward. I don't know, Simi, did you want to say anything from the first few weeks of our transitions inspection about what you've noticed on that?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And it's quite really positive to pick up the positive morale amongst the staff in terms of the move to the unified model. But it is certainly an area that we are trying to explore. It's very early. We're only in week 2 at the moment of this transition inspection. But that's certainly something that is coming up in some of our responsible officer, but also middle management groups as well. So an area that we've highlighted and that we'll continue to explore as we progress with the transition.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Could I just come back to Denise as well?
Thanks,
so
Helen.
Jumping in, Justin. Sorry. Just to say, it's music to my ears to say that you felt that you'd been supported by the inspectorate. I know we can be, it can be a bit scary for people to be inspected because you're completely under the microscope. But we work really hard to try and do inspections with people, not to people. And because we're all in the same game, which is trying to improve the quality of the service that's delivered. So thank you for that. It's really, really good to hear. Cheers.
No, that's very sincere feedback, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Thanks.
Catherine?
Okay, yeah, sure. Our next question comes from Lucy Ankin. You mentioned further work is being completed to look at progress against recovery, looking at 240 cases in depth. Are you able to give an overview of the detail you're looking at? I work as a quality development officer for MPS, and we've been doing our own recovery audits. I'd be interested to know what areas you're measuring for us to consider anything we may be missing. I think that's quite a long question. So perhaps,
no, Helen, would you like to pick that one up? You've been very closely involved in our recovery thematic.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Lucy. That's it's great to hear that you're doing audits along the same lines that we are. Just to say a couple of things, really. First of all, we're having to actually use the term recovery a little bit loosely because not everywhere is actually as recovering as well as other areas, obviously, given the state of the nation and the patchy kind of way in which COVID is hitting places. But what we've essentially done, it's to a large extent, it's modelled on the same kind of principles and standards within our core standards, but we have kind of made it a bit more bespoke so that we're not just focusing on everything as normal, but how it's progressing from where it was under the EDM, exceptional delivery models, into where it is in the future. So we've in effect got a bespoke set of standards for the casework element in particular, that is modelled on the core standards, but adapted. But obviously the casework, the 240 cases, is only part of the picture. And we're doing the usual meetings with staff at all levels and partners, etc., to get a real understanding about things like how unpaid work is getting back to normal or anywhere near the new normal. How accredited programs are working out under the new alternative delivery framework, etc.
Catherine.
Lovely, thanks. We've got a question here from Phil Sutcliffe, and it's about learning and development. Is there any correlation between the performance of probation providers or probation staff and the provision of learning development opportunities? Are there any significant observations you have made in this area of probation business which might be useful for consideration prior to unification?
Well, I'll hand over to Simi and Helen in a minute, but it's certainly training is something that we have been picking up in our inspections, and a variety in the quality and delivery of training to frontline staff, including in the MPS. Actually, I think our national inspection of the MPS at the beginning of the year identified real issues around continuous professional development. I think people recognise that the PQIP, the initial training, is a good product, but there really isn't enough in the way of ongoing professional development after that. And I know that's a priority for the service. I think CRCs have invested in training, but what we're not seeing is that then coming through into the results sometimes. So a lot of effort's gone into base management, for example, in the past year, but that didn't show up in some of our scores. So I think maybe some way to go. I don't know, Simi, did you have views on that?
Thanks, Justin. I suppose I agree with what Justin said in terms of the level of and quality of training that's provided. In many instances, we did find there to be good training plans available and learning and development needs identified. Often it was the opportunity to then apply the learning within the cases. Sometimes in terms of the inspection activity, it may be that training has taken place and then we are conducting our inspection. So actually we're not finding the impact or the outcome of those training events within the casework that we were naturally looking into. We are also due to consider the learning and development offer that's available in the future as well, that the probation workforce programme are developing. So it's useful and a good opportunity for us to be able to feed into their future programme and development that's taking place.
I think one of the other issues is the way that training is delivered, and people saying that they're finding that quite difficult. So people finding it difficult to fit training into their working lives and dropping out of courses. I think Northwest MPS, for example, we found people were having to travel down from Cumbria to Preston for some basic training face to face. One of the silver linings, I guess, of COVID is that we're all getting used to using Teams, and we've got much better kit now for doing these things online, and that may improve the ability to deliver some of this training, but we shall see. But a big area to keep an eye on, I think. Have we got time for one last question, Catherine?
Yes, and this comes from Andrew. Andrew hasn't given his location. I think he possibly might be from the Cabinet Office. Do unmute yourself if I've got that incorrect. Did you compare the health, safety and well-being of staff and improvement of workplace accommodation between NPS and CRC?
We certainly have a range of questions. We ask staff about their opinion around accommodation facilities, IT, that sort of thing. In the first domain of our inspection methodology, as I think I showed in one of the early graphs, actually CRCs tend to often score reasonably well on the quality of accommodation that people are working in, and people have welcomed that, and generally the provision of things like IT kit. Is an interesting area, obviously run by the MPS rather than CRCs, and we found some real issues sometimes with the quality of APs, and the lack of maintenance of those has been an issue going forward. Helen, did you want to say anything about that particular aspect of our methodology and what we find?
To be honest, I think you've more or less said it. Obviously, it varies, but I guess one of the things just to re-emphasise is that where staff are involved in the design of buildings, and service users in particular. And I'm thinking of in DLNR CRC in Nottinghamshire, the way in which service users inputted into the design of the reception area, and the fact that they have peer mentors who kind of mill around in reception in order to support people. That makes a huge difference in terms of how the environment feels. And then, of course, obviously, environments such as the community hubs similarly make probation areas feel less kind of punitive, really, I think is probably the word.
Yeah, and I think I flagged earlier on, I think that's been a really important area of innovation by CRCs, has been thinking imaginatively about how they can take some of the barriers down and create a more normal, welcoming environment. And a lot of work has gone into that, and you have to bring staff with you. It's quite a big change of culture to expect people to work in that way, and I think that's been managed. MTC model office in Bexley, really attractive working environment and a welcoming space for service users, and some similar ones around the country. So I really hope that can be preserved as we go forward into the new unified structure, and thinking continues about that really important aspect of delivery.
Thank you, Justin. I think we're at time, and actually I think we've got through all of the questions that are on the chat and through the raising of the hand. So thank you everybody who's asked a question today.